Okay, commissioners, it's 1 o'clock. What do you say we all get on camera and say hello?
I'm right here.
Yep, you've got childcare, I remember. All righty, so we're back. It's 1 o'clock and we're going to pick back up with our transportation requirements and procedures for development briefing with Stephen Roberts and his LUT department colleagues. Take it away, Stephen.
All right, thank you, Chair and Commissioners. We're back again. This is our second briefing on this topic. We were here on May 11th chatting with you all about this, and you all raised, excuse me, raised a number of good questions and identified some additional information that would be helpful as we work through this topic. So I've got Aaron Wardell, our Principal Transportation Planner, and Stacy Shetler, County Engineer, will walk us through a presentation that I hope will help respond to some of the questions that we heard and provide some additional information that we hope will be helpful as we sort of navigate through this process of developing refinements to our existing requirements for transportation development review. And so with that, I will turn it over to Aaron to start walking us through, I think.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, Chair Harrington and members of the Board of Commissioners. My name is Aaron Wardell. I am the Principal Transportation Planner. Next slide, please. So Stephen just walked through this timeline. We were here about a month ago. This is our second briefing where we hope to answer the questions that were raised last time and walk through a little bit more of the history of our transportation system funding approach. Later this year, if we're given board direction to do so, we're bringing up consideration of an updated procedures document. Next slide. So we'll come back to these questions at the end, so keep them in mind for the presentation. Does the board have questions, additional questions regarding the history of our transportation development review process? And is the board interested in considering an update to our policy guidance regarding transportation development review and/or funding? Next slide. So this slide outlines some of the questions and additional information that the board requested at our last presentation. So there was interest in understanding a little bit more of the background and history of how we got to our current policy and our transportation funding in general. There were questions about city development requirements compared to county development requirements and additional information requested about how we coordinate with city staff. The board also asked to understand a little bit more the outcomes we're trying to achieve with this work and how this proposed update will advance our practice. Next slide. So as a refresher, some background on this effort, our current regulations for transportation development review were adopted 35 years ago as a part of Resolution and Order 8695. This resolution and order defines the process for determining transportation system improvements required as a part of development. This R&O applies to unincorporated Washington County, both urban and rural, and it's also used to evaluate developments within cities that impact county roads. This update was included in the long-range planning work program, actually for the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So a little bit more background about what we're hoping to achieve with this update. So this slide is showing an image of Blanton Street. This segment of Blanton is a collector. It's an unincorporated urban Washington County. And what this photo shows is that this area has seen some redevelopment in recent years. You can see some lots that have been redeveloped and have built sidewalks, and some lots that have not, that were probably built in the 50s or 60s. And so what we have out in the system pretty commonly are these sidewalk gaps. So these gaps are typically addressed either as properties redevelop or through publicly funded programs. Like we may go in with our urban road maintenance district and do a project here. We may go in with a major street improvement program project and fill in the gaps along this road. The other way to fill in this gap is for, say, those parcels that are missing sidewalks to come in for redevelopment, in which case we would generally require them to build the missing sidewalk. And what we're hoping to do as a part of this proposed update is to also create an opportunity for nearby parcels to be incentivized to fill this gap if there's an opportunity for them to do that. So that's a part of the methodology that we're hoping to update at this time. Next slide, please. Additionally, we may have cases where we have large developments that are large enough to require not just safety improvements in our system, but also some capacity improvements. An example of a typical capacity type improvement would be additional turn lanes at an intersection. So this slide is showing a part of North Bethany. North Bethany is an example of development that is of such a scale that it could call for a review of capacity at nearby intersections. And so our proposed update includes methodology for the developer and county staff to include an evaluation of capacity needs at nearby intersections for these very large developments. Next slide. So as a reminder of where this fits into the development review process, all development applications must complete appropriate transportation improvements. These are subject to the concepts of proportionality, which I'll talk about on the next slide a little bit more. So transportation development review has two pieces. There's requirements in the Community Development Code. Those generally apply to the specific development site. So that's standard frontage improvements like building the sidewalk, things like considering driveway access, site distance, and then dedicating appropriate right-of-way. Then we have our transportation development review component, which applies to the transportation engineering requirements. And I see Chair Harrington, you have your hand up.
I'll hold it until after you finish this slide, but before we go to the next, because I don't want to be left behind.
Okay, so that sounds fine. So to finish up this slide, this is the technical requirements for engineering safety associated with individual development applications. And then the third component is the payment of the transportation development tax, which is intended to pay for the system capacity impacts of the development. And now we can take your question.
So I understand from your previous slides that we're talking about county roads that may be in cities or roads in any of our any of our unincorporated areas, rural and urban.
Both, yes.
Yes. I have a case that I'm wondering about. So there are, well, actually, maybe it's two. There are recent UGB expansion areas where the property hasn't yet been annexed into cities because they're waiting for development applications. If we have a county facility for consideration there, do you then use the city, more of that city-county relationship? Or that's what makes common sense to me. So those areas that are in those UGB expansion areas or in those urban reserve areas that we know will be under the responsibility of cities. Do those cases fit under on your slide 4, city development requirements versus county requirements? Or is that an altogether different bucket?
In those cases where the area has, or the parcel has not yet been annexed into a city, it falls under county land use review. So it meets all county land use review requirements. Now, generally when that happens, it's because a property is, oftentimes it's has a plan designation of FD20, future development, 20-acre parcels. So there's limited development allowed on those parcels while we're waiting for the cities to finish planning and annex them. But there are things that people can do with those properties. And so this does happen. They come in, they want to do some kind of land use development application. Okay. Generally, we reach out to the city that would eventually annex the property and talk to them as we're going through the development review process. This happens quite a bit with City of Wilsonville, for example, with the industrial area, Coffee Creek and Basalt Creek areas. Okay,
I think I've taken care of that that case for myself. So I'm on the journey clearly. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the concepts of nexus and proportionality, because these are really important concepts in land use planning and how we do development review. Nexus is the concept that we must demonstrate that the development creates the need for the improvement, and the conditions of approval must relate directly to the nature of the proposed development. So this is a bar that county staff have to clear when we're doing our development review. And then there's the concept of proportionality, and that means that once we've made the case that the improvement is required by the development, the scale of the mitigation must also be reasonable to what the development application is. So these two concepts of nexus and proportionality really guide the work that we do when we are reviewing applications and determining conditions of approval. So depending on the size of development, typical improvements we require are things like frontage improvements. That's a pretty low bar to clear. Generally, we require development to do frontage improvements unless it's a very, very small development application. There could be a requirement for a traffic signal at a nearby intersection offsite. That would be an example of a pretty common safety related improvement. You're building several houses, you're going to generate quite a bit of traffic. We're going to need to see a traffic signal so that we don't create an unsafe condition. We also could see a requirement at a nearby intersection for additional turn lanes. And that's an example of a capacity improvement that could be required for a large scale development. Next slide. So this slide is a timeline of the history of really how we do transportation system planning and funding in Washington County. And this was something that the board asked for last time. So it all goes back to 1984. The Growth Management Policy Task Force was convened. And at that time, Washington County was starting to grow quite a bit, starting to change. And there was an acknowledgement that we needed a plan going forward for how we were going to build our transportation system. So the outcomes of that task force led to all of these other items in the list. In 1985, we adopted the traffic impact fee, which was the system development charge for transportation capacity improvements. In 1986, we passed the first major streets improvement program levy, which was intended to build out our transportation system in cases where development was not going to be able to build it. And we also adopted RNO 8695, the item we're here considering. In 1988, we adopted our first transportation system plan. Prior to that, we used a regional interim transportation system plan. The transportation system plan has been updated several times since 1988. In 1990, the TIF program was expanded to all of the cities within Washington County. And then in 2008, the TIF was replaced by the Transportation Development Tax. So in these next slides, I'm going to go through each of these a little bit more in detail. Next slide. So the Growth Management Policy Task Force determined there was a need for a transportation system development charge in order to pay for the capacity needs associated with development. There was a recognition at that time that it is difficult to distinguish between the safety requirements of development and capacity required as a part of development. And so staff were given direction to tease those things out and figure out a way to pay for both of them. And what staff came up with were the development of the traffic impact fee, which was adopted by ordinance, and the development of Resolution Order 8695. Next slide. So the traffic impact fee was the implementation of the need to fund capacity improvements associated with growth. As I said, it initially applied only to unincorporated Washington County, but in 1990, it was expanded to cover the whole county, including the cities. And it funded improvements to provide additional capacity on major city and county and some state roads and transit systems. Next slide. So then in 1986, RNO 8695 was adopted. So the title of this RNO really hammers home that point that it was intended to be complementary to the traffic impact fee ordinance because it's called Determining Traffic Safety Requirements under the Traffic Impact Fee Ordinance. It implemented the safety-based process for determining what else a developer needs to build on the system in addition to paying their TIF. The county, at that time, county staff were responsible for determining what those system safety deficiencies were and what developers would be required to build. And then the county collected the TIF payment. Next slide. In 1986, we passed the first levy for the Major Street Improvement Program, and that was created to fund both safety and capacity needs on major county roadways. This was re-upped with additional levies in 1989 and 1995, and then rolled into the county's permanent tax rate in 1997. We've had a couple MSTIP presentations this year, and we'll be coming back for more, so you're going to be hearing a lot about MSTIP in the next few months. The guiding principles for MSTIP projects are that they improve safety, they improve traffic flow or relieve congestion, that they are built on major roads used by many residents, really getting at that regional importance of the program, and that they address multimodal demand for cars, trucks, bicycles, pedestrians, and or transit. Next slide. So in 2008, actually in 2002, there was an update to the county's transportation system plan. And as a part of that work, staff identified that there was a significant gap between the cost of meeting our identified needs and the funding available. And so the outcome of that was direction to update the traffic impact fee. And so that became in 2008, the transportation development tax. At the time that it was adopted, or passed actually by vote, it was estimated that the transportation development tax covered about 28% of development impact, and that doubled the impact that TIF had been building on the system. Next slide. So this graphic summarizes all of those points I just went through, really, that our transportation funding in Washington County is often described as this three-legged stool of these three different funding sources or types of funding sources that do some different things. So we have our development contributions over on the left. This is our TIF, which became the TDT. We have two special transportation system development charges for our growth areas of North Bethany and Bonnie Slope West. That's because those were greenfield master planned areas that had significant transportation needs, so they paid a little bit more towards those system improvements. And then the developer constructed improvements, so things the developers are required to build on the system. We then have our publicly funded system maintenance, which is paid for through road fund, which is gas taxes and our vehicle registration fee, and our urban road maintenance district, which applies to the urban unincorporated area. And then we have our publicly funded capital projects, and that's our major street improvement program projects, as well as projects that are funded by other regional, state, and federal funds. So this is how it all comes together as this three-legged stool. Next slide. So I'm actually going to pause before I go through this slide and see if we have any questions about transportation funding or any of the material we've covered so far. Don't see any hands popping up. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on. So quite a bit of the questions that we talked through last time related to how does the county compare to the cities and how do we do things differently from the cities? So some of these points we talked about last time, we've updated them a little bit. So some of the commonalities between the way the county does our business and the way the cities do our business is that we all use these thresholds that are based on an estimate of how many additional vehicle trips are added to the system by development. None of the jurisdictions currently have explicit bicycle or pedestrian review criteria. That's one of the things we'd like to accomplish through this proposed update. I know at least one city is also considering an update to do this as a part of their development review at this time, and so we've been talking to them a bit about that. We all use the same national traffic engineering manuals and guidelines, and we all collect the transportation development tax. So some of the differences between how we do our work is that the cities do generally condition motor vehicle capacity improvements, again, things like turn lanes, based on a calculation of the volume to capacity ratio at intersections. That means how many cars are trying to get through the intersection and how many lanes are available for the cars to do that. So cities have a methodology with a number attached to that volume to capacity ratio. If their estimates show that the development exceeds that capacity, then they generally require a mitigation at that intersection. Whereas the county uses a motor vehicle safety-based approach. We don't necessarily always look at that volume to capacity ratio as a part of doing development review because we're thinking about things in terms of what safety improvements are needed on the system. That doesn't mean we don't necessarily get to the same place. Sometimes the county does require additional turn lanes, for example, as a part of the safety review, but we have a different philosophy in how we get there. And the other big difference between the cities and the county is that oftentimes, I don't know if I should say oftentimes, but some of the cities have specific intersection capacity needs called out in their plan documents. So they can open up their plan document and see at this particular intersection, we think we need a right turn lane and a left turn lane. The county doesn't have that level of specificity in our transportation system plan. Our system plan applies to links. So we know how many lanes we need on a road, but not specifically how many turn lanes we need at intersections. And this is really just a function of the fact that the county is a lot bigger than any of our individual cities, and the county's transportation system plan covers the entire county, including the city. So a little bit of different way of doing business and what we have adopted in our plans there. Yes.
If I could just add a comment, as a Metro councilor, I saw across 3 of the 4 cities that were in my Metro Council district, that city councils were also interested in their community development objectives for different areas. And while from the differences subsection, 2 of them make it sound like the cities are only interested in capacity improvements and intersection expansions. The relationship that I think is still underway that they're trying to figure out, and I think about Forest Grove, Hillsborough, and Beaverton all doing this, are trying to figure out how to integrate those community development objectives, which are pretty area specific, with transportation plans that sometimes lose that area applicability. So I'm not trying to influence anything or say that what you have here is wrong. It's not wrong, but there's that other element that I see play out in cities. So I just wanted to make sure to mention it. That's all.
Yeah, no, and I think that is really important. This slide is intended to speak specifically to how we do this engineering transportation review, which is a little bit different than looking back at our community plans. And, you know, while I say that the county's transportation system plan it's a little bit more general, it's a little bit more high level because it covers the whole county. Our community plans are similar, right? We have a really large unincorporated area. We have community plans that haven't been updated in a number of years. The cities have done more work in that area. I think oftentimes they have a better understanding of what they want.
Well, and I appreciate your articulating that, Erin. I do. But frankly, I think at our elected levels, we don't quite think that segmented. There is that integration, and there needs to be that integration because it's all dealing with community outcomes, which is a level that we need to stay at, whether we're talking about us as a county commission or a city council. So, yeah.
And I would just add, I think to Erin's point, you know, we do have identified in between our community plans and transportation plans, we do have some special areas that are identified, things like pedestrian districts or town centers. And so that's an excellent point, Chair, that there are these complex interplays between sort of these broader community planning objectives and the sort of transportation capacity objectives. And oftentimes those two are in some tension. And so those things definitely do play out through these development review processes and our capital improvement processes as well. Mm-hmm. That's a great point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's different sometimes at that high level policy guidance level, and then what individual staff are looking at when they're doing this review, and sometimes not always making those connections. So we certainly hear that point. Next slide. So now we get into some case studies. We were trying to think of a way to really show how this would play out in the real world. And so what this graphic is showing on the left side is an existing conditions of, we've got a large development site. It's along a roadway with 2 nearby intersections. On the left side, we have a traffic signal, and based on that volume to capacity ratio calculation, because of this development happening, that intersection is going to exceed its capacity. There's going to be a lot of traffic backed up trying to get through this signal. On the right side, we have a stop sign, not a signal. And based on our safety analysis of this intersection, it seems like it's time to put in a traffic signal there because we'll have a lot of vehicles trying to turn left, right, with oncoming traffic. So the way that this could play out, and this is intended to be really hypothetical, but the way we believe this would play out, comparing a city development review to the way the county does development review, is that the county would likely prioritize replacing that stop sign with a signal, because that's what would filter through in our safety-based analysis. But because the city's development review procedures require meeting that volume to capacity ratio, they may require installing the turn lanes at the existing signal rather than the stop sign. Now, if there are city staff watching right now, they might be saying, actually, no, we would just ask for both. And that could be true. And actually, the county might ask for both too, because we could make a case that this traffic queue at the signal is causing a safety problem and we need those additional turn lanes. But what this was trying to speak to is that because, again, of this concept of proportionality, sometimes we can only get some of the things we would like to get. And so if there was a case where we could only get one, the county would likely prioritize the signal and a city would likely prioritize the turn lanes. Any questions about this example before we move on? We were trying to think of a way to do this really hypothetically. Okay, we'll move on. Next slide, please. So how does the county coordinate with cities? We already talked about this a little bit, thinking about some of those new urban areas and how that works. So the county does participate in development review processes for city developments that impact county roads. The city is still the land use authority. And so while they generally incorporate county staff recommendations into their conditions of development approval, that's their call because they're the ones writing those conditions of development review. We use our same review criteria when we're doing the review of developments in the cities. So we use that focus on safety, even though we know the cities have this different requirement. So we're using our RNO 8695 in both these cases. We do coordinate pretty extensively with our city partners. And so as a part of doing this update, we've met with several city staff. Based on the last presentation, we've been requested to talk to a couple of city staff again, and we'd like to take this back to the coordinating committee, Transportation Advisory Committee again to talk through this update and hear a little bit more about what some of the cities are thinking about with updating their development review processes as well. Next slide. So moving into a little bit more information again about this proposed update and what it would accomplish, or what we're hoping it would accomplish. We are proposing to retain our existing policy framework, which continues to focus on the safety evaluation rather than motor vehicle performance. When we think again about that concept of proportionality, county staff have generally found that you can condition more safety improvements without worrying about the proportionality of them because they're safety. It's different than those capacity improvements, which are very clearly tied in with nexus and proportionality. We are proposing expanding our safety review to incorporate system completeness and accessibility through off-site multimodal improvements. Again, this is getting at incentivizing development to fill some of those sidewalk gaps when they can do it. We'd like to broaden our safety definition and analysis to explicitly incorporate bicycle and pedestrian elements. We are adding in that larger developments would be required to perform some capacity analysis and identify mitigation options. Again, this is somewhat of an incentivizing rather than a requirement, but it's still a good opportunity possibly for us to have some of these things built. And then we'd like to just generally clarify our procedures and update definitions. Since it goes back to 1986, it's kind of time for some of these basic refresh options. And then finally, we would reduce requirements for smaller developments, although the community development code requirements would still apply where they would anyway. Next slide. So we shared this table last time, and I think what we heard was it was a little bit too abstract and hard to really grasp how this might play out. And so we have a couple of case studies on the next slide where we'll be going through some graphics to talk about this. But and the takeaway from this is that we're using these average daily traffic estimates in order to determine which type of review a development application needs to go through. And when there's less than 40 trips a day, which is about equivalent to 4 single-family homes, the developments are exempt from this additional transportation safety review. They're still required to do everything required by the community development code. And then the other requirements are layered on depending on how large the development is. Next slide. So this is our case study for less than 40 trips a day. So this is 4 homes or less. And we would require this development to comply with the community development code, but it would be exempt from additional transportation review. Next slide. So this is a slightly larger development, 40 to 200 trips a day. That's about 4 to 20 homes if this was a residential development. This would actually have no change from our current process. So we would have no additional requirements for a development of this size. Next slide. Now we're getting into more of our medium-sized developments, so estimated at 200 to 500 trips a day. So in this case, this is where that safety and multimodal study would come into play. County staff would provide where we know we have system gaps, and we would offer a developer the opportunity to build these. So in this particular example, we look at where the site's located. It's on a collector. We've identified there's a sidewalk gap between the site and a nearby school. We've also identified that we're missing an ADA ramp at a nearby intersection, so we could provide this to a developer. And if it's eligible for TDT credit, they would be able to do that and then receive the TDT credit. And some developers may be willing to do these improvements anyway because it helps their development. Next slide. And so then for our really large developments, 500 trips a day, we would also include a capacity assessment study. And so in this case, that could call out that there is a traffic signal nearby. It's exceeding a volume to capacity ratio. So this could be an opportunity to do a capacity assessment. And again, a developer may find there's an incentive to do that through transportation development tax credits. There could also be a safety reason to require that development to that improvement or mitigation to be built. So before we move on, are there any questions about these case studies we've run through? Okay, next slide. So I wanted to show what this multimodal analysis could actually look like. Through a number of different planning projects we've completed recently, we think we have a pretty good inventory of gaps in our system. That's primarily on the collector and arterial system. We have a pretty good understanding of where we're missing sidewalks and bike lanes. We've also been working on our ADA ramp assessment. So we don't know everything about the system, but we did a test case. If there was a development at the intersection of Barnes and Cedar Hills, are there gaps within a mile of that? And guess what? There are. There's quite a few. And so if we had a development come in at this location, county staff could easily provide them with this and say, are you interested in filling any of these gaps as a part of your development application in exchange for TDT credit, or we can use it in order to see if there's any safety improvements that could be required as a part of that development. So I think this is a pretty useful tool. We wanted to include this just to show you what it would look like when a developer comes in. Yes, Chair Harrington?
Does the right of way exist for all of those proposed improvements?
We don't know. That's something that we would have to go in and evaluate as well in each case. Yeah.
All righty, thank you.
But yeah, it's spot on observation again. That's definitely a very relevant concern. If right of way exists or not, that certainly can influence the decision of whether or not the developer might be able to move forward with a proposed voluntary improvement.
Right, the acquisition of additional right-of-way is a pretty high bar to clear oftentimes, but there's plenty of cases where we do own the right-of-way, we just don't have the infrastructure in there. So that's another piece we could add to this data. Next slide.
And I was going to say too, I think those offsite right-of-way, if a developer were to acquire some offsite right-of-way, they actually can be eligible for TDT credit for that purchase as well.
So in summary, our proposed approach for the update maintains our existing policy framework, going back to 1984 and all of these other documents that we've adopted, and our funding approach, we're generally consistent with that in this proposed update. Our funding approach is built around that current policy. Our proposed update encourages additional developer-initiated improvements through voluntary offsite improvements, and in some cases, some additional requirements. We think that the safety approach has a strong nexus to required improvements because of the objective nature of the county safety criteria. So that's part of the reason we've stuck with this for so many years as a part of the way that we do our review. Next slide. So back to these policy questions. Does the board have any questions regarding the history of our transportation development review process? Is the board interested in considering this update to our policy guidance? And would any additional information be helpful? We are happy to come back to do another work session. We could also prepare a briefing memo if that would be an easier way to communicate additional information. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's leave that slide up and see from commissioners, do you have any questions or comments on the material you've seen, as well as answers to these questions? Go ahead, Commissioner Rogers, and then Commissioner Willie.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron and Stephen. It always is nice to have a walk through memory lane. I have to profess, I was here in 85 on. I remember each and every one of those actions. What we couldn't have envisioned at the time, and I'm just going to make a couple of comments and then get to the point. We couldn't envision that we'd double in population. That was not on the horizon. We also never envisioned that the county would have such large unincorporated areas still remaining today. That was never on the horizon. So we thought that trajectory, though it was building with Intel and others, would be a little less robust and more steady, and that there would be broad areas annexed. So as far as what you're doing, whether you're doing capacity, whether you're doing safety, I mean, we could talk about those arguments all day, and the cities would argue differently, and who knows who's right on all of that. My issues continue to be, and have always been, that we've never gone to the systemic issue of how we ever get out of these problems of having this transportation network that's really not going to function forever without large sums of dollars. We've known that, we said that, we've dealt with that. You say, what's that got to do with what we're looking at here? Well, we're piecemealing it. We're saying to the development community, gee, we got these safety improvements. So they do a block, but there are large areas in this county. In my area, it could be Metzger, it could be a Garden Home, the whole low area. Up north where Pam is, not so much the Bethany because it's so doggone new, but you know, Cedar Hill, Cedar Mills, where it was never built to have the walking, pedestrian, active transportation, never was built to have the sort of transportation systems that we need today. So the real question is, are we going to continue over some period of time having these developments, and we're going to try to extract whatever we can out in terms of safety improvements from the development community, or we do little chunks at a time, and whoever's sitting in our seats, 10, 20, 30 years out are going to say, we have the same real problems? Or is there a more holistic approach of saying, how do we go back and chat about a transportation system? And I'm not saying local streets, I'm saying more of what we did. We sat down at WCC and defined what the county road system is that we all use. How do we redefine that, and how do we come up with some incentivized method to get this into incorporated cities? Or if people don't, that there is some additional costs in terms of our ERM, which we set up. That I didn't know it'd go this long. It doesn't have all, I mean, you got good pavement coverage, I understand, but it's not doing all the sidewalk transportation issues, the active transportation issues. So would additional information be helpful? No. Additional discussion, yeah, is our policy guidance regarding funding up to date as we see the world. We're looking at a slice of it, we're not looking at it holistically. And do I need any questions or information on there? No, I've lived it. I know what I know what the system is and how we came up. I just don't see, and it's my venting a little bit, and I'll stop. I don't see us making any progress. We are where we are, and our legacy to our next generation of commissioners is they're inheriting what we never took care of. So that's my personal opinion.
Well, I'll just say, Commissioner Rogers, I have each of you on one side of me. And then the Hollywood Squares. This is one place where I just lost my monitor, sorry, where I have the same thought as you, where it's not getting any better from the standpoint of we continue to have this piecemeal approach. But on the other hand, the cities don't have a complete system either. So had you not been doing what you've been doing for 35 plus years, we wouldn't have the near functional system that we have today. So, but there are certainly a lot of unfinished business. I'll give you that. So,
Can I respond? Because Chair, you made a comment,
absolutely.
Chair, a couple of times, which I think, and I'm going to compliment you because you see the vision and you understand the vision. And you've talked about the vision before. You and I personally talked about it.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, we've worked really, really hard. I just think we need to have the dialogue to work harder. And, you know, your legacy as chair, or mine as I, you know, ending my career is, are we going to do anything about it? Are we going to continue to piecemeal? And I understand the cities are piecemealing too, but I think they're aggressively trying to have a broader discussion. And it's exactly, and I'm going to pick on you because it's exactly the one you've been talking about. So
Yep. Glad
exactly.
you're raising it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what I did. I moved my monitor somehow, so I'm looking at a black screen. So I need audio for you to tell me who wants to speak next.
Well, this
Commissioner
Jerry.
Willie, great, thank you.
Well, obviously, my question is much more elementary, since I don't have the perspective, I guess, of either of you in this. But I just want to understand that in the case studies that you presented, you talked about trips per day. And we went from 200 to 500 is in one category, which I don't know if that's significant. And then 500 trips up. And that would seem to me that there'd be some of the larger developments would be considerably higher than 500 trips. So give me an example, if you could, of the difference between a development that has 200 versus a development that have 500 versus a development that might have, I don't know, 2,500 or 3,000 or something. I mean, like an Intel. I mean, what's the trips per day for an Intel development versus some of the other much smaller ones? So can you give me a perspective there?
So we almost always relate these to houses because that's the easiest one for most of us to envision. And so 200 is about 20 houses, 500 is about 50 houses. So 50 plus houses is kind of our largest development category. You are absolutely right. There's a huge difference between a 50 lot subdivision and what Nike has done on their campus, right? There's a lot more trips generated there. But these are generally the same categories that our cities and partner jurisdictions across the region use. If you look at their different categories, so that 500 a day it's a pretty standard breaking point for a large development. That's not to say they all use exactly this. They have a slightly different way of doing it, but it sort of equals out. And I don't know if Stacy wants to chime in on that or has an idea of something other than houses we could use to compare this.
Well, the other way that it gets done is by square footage of the retail or commercial facility. But like with an Intel, you start counting employees. So how many employees are showing up in the morning and how many employees are leaving? Because that's going to affect your peak travel times. And so that's where the capacity constraints are seen the most, is during those peak times with your left turn lanes and your signals and your right turn lanes and things like that. So I don't have I don't know off the top of my head the employee numbers for Intel. We'd be happy to find that information and bring it back to you. But as Aaron has said, the number of houses, one house generates about 10 trips a day is the easiest way to think about that.
Well, so then we look at a South Hillsborough development that obviously was brand new, considerably more than 20 or 30 or 50 houses, and encompassed a number of Washington County roads, TV highway, obviously an ODOT facility, Cornelius Pass. I mean, so what were the rules that we applied to all of those different streets and major thoroughfares? How did the rules apply to all those?
So those are, that's a really great point to bring up about South Hillsborough. So the master planned new urban areas go through a process of determining at a high level what transportation system plan improvements they need. And so when South Hillsborough was coming into the urban growth boundary, the city did the analysis necessary to determine how much money it's going to cost to build out the transportation system in order to accommodate an additional 8,000 households. And so they went through that process. They developed a funding plan, which included the supplemental transportation system development charge that's applied to all development within South Hillsborough. And then they negotiated with ODOT and with us about what improvements would be done on our facilities, on the county facilities, as well as on TV Highway. When each individual development then came in for development review with City of Hillsborough, they negotiated what additional improvements they would have to make as a part of that development. So that was things like, a collector facility that goes through this developer's area, or the local roads within that developer's area that are going to serve all of those houses. So the developers generally built those on their own and then contributed towards some of the bigger offsite improvements, like, building Blanton and building Cornelius Pass Road and the new rail crossing. So there's a whole package of improvements associated with those big master plan developments.
Yeah, I can understand how certainly the complexity of that one, and then you grind that back down to just a residential development that would be normal. And so, this has been a good, also a walkthrough time. I was on city council in Hillsborough in 92 to 97. And so I still remember some of this conversation going on. It was pretty new concept at that point in time. So I get where the chair and Roy are going with a visionary process. But anyway, thank you for the re-education of all this.
I would just like to say thank you again, and thanks for coming back with even more information. I haven't heard from my other fellow board members about the interest in considering an update to our policy. So I'm anxious to hear what your thoughts are there. I'd like to hear that, Roy and Jerry and Nafisa and Catherine.
Well, I can jump in. I support, I don't have questions. I would say the first question, does the board have a question regarding the history? I think, thank you so much for that presentation. I really appreciate it, and I learned a lot. In terms of the second question, I am interested in updating. So I support the idea of going forward to update our policy regarding transportation development review. So I think just like our strategic plan, we're due for a review, and I think it's due time. So I support that. Mr. Harrington, you're muted.
Thank you. I will go next, and I think that there may be some comment after that. So I appreciated the timeline on slide 10. The one specific date I'll have to remind myself of prior to, definitely prior to 1990, is where the strategic plan was developed and then adopted. No change here. It's just something I wanted to mention. I appreciated on slide 14 that you mentioned in 2002 that despite the progress and the introduction of the MSTIP program was really significant and is something that I am grateful for Commissioner Rogers and all of our predecessors having put forward. But as you said, 2002 recognized a recognition that the gap between needs and funding was so significant that a financial update was needed. I was an elected official during the latter timeframe of the development of the transition from the traffic impact fee over to the TDT. And even though the voters approved a doubling of the impact fee, we still have gaps. So really it leads to my first comment directed at, or suggestion of change. And it's on slide 16. This slide is, as currently represented, is a little misleading. Yes, you have the legs right. Those are our existing legs. But if we're going to stick with the stool, then I think we need to take pie slices out of the top of that stool, because it is not a complete system. It does not fund all of the needs. Another way to look at it is really it's the a outline of a chair where we're missing a leg. We have 3 legs of the chair, and part of the back of the chair is missing, and there are chunks out of the seat, right? We're doing okay. We have a place to rest, but it isn't complete. And frankly, I don't know the answer to the question, is there a complete system anywhere in the state of Oregon or anywhere in our nation, in any community? Given that communities evolve, and for at least the places I want to live, they tend to be growth areas, right? So we tend to be behind. So I felt the need to comment on that graphic. I agree with the intent that you're trying to convey. Then all the different case studies, thank you for listing out the current process and what the proposed policy update is. I appreciated seeing that there would be multimodal studies, data provided by staff, for example. And on slide 20, I appreciated that part of this update is broadening the safety definition analysis to incorporate bicycle and pedestrian elements as well. Because I assume, even though I didn't live here back in 1986 with that RNO, that there are more people walking. Certainly after COVID, I know I'm seeing it, right? Even though I've lived in the same place. And certainly a larger number of people cycling to work, wherever they're going. Number of people now on a per capita basis, it may not have changed at all for all I know. Don't know. I don't have that data in front of me. So for the proposals that you have here, I am supportive of these proposals. In essence, it seems like these proposals will potentially help. But it seems to me, and I think this gets to the heart of the matter that Commissioner Rogers is pointing out, is that the volume of physical improvements that we'll see by virtue of this update are largely unchanged. We'll see some, we'll see a few, but not in a major way. That said, I am erring on the side of safety. Thank you very much. I continue to struggle myself with there are places such as right near my direct little neighborhood, Jenkins Road was improved. We are continuous sidewalks there now, continuous bike paths, 1 additional travel lane, and I have no problem with that capacity expansion and fitting in through the needs of that area. But bigger, in this case, more lanes, shouldn't also mean a faster speed. And that's where I think I find myself having conversations with Stacy. And no, I'm not trying to direct him here nor there. I'm rather just letting you know my points of discomfort. And since our last conversation, Stacy, I have come to really appreciate the artistry, really the skill of truck drivers and bus drivers, TriMet bus drivers at the intersection of Hawken and Jenkins. They do so masterfully. You know, it's 2 lanes and 2 lanes without any special circumstances, and they're doing just fine. So I'm always impressed with them. I am supportive of this. I don't have any other questions. I'm supportive of this, but I think Commissioner Rogers is right to point out that it does feel a bit piecemeal in a way, you know, progress, but nothing significant. And we do have to think carefully about how we're going to go about those need discussions because the need is significant. And if we are going to take a proposal out to our community, we need to be able to demonstrate what are the outcomes that have value to each of our communities. Going into this, much like the cases that you heard me ask for clarification earlier, I wanted to make sure that those areas, those UGB expansion and urban reserve areas that we know are closest to being brought in over the next 20 years, that they would most significantly come under the purview of cities. Improvements for redevelopment in our urban unincorporated areas. These updates help in that regard. I don't think, however, if I go back to the beginning of the presentation, for the incentivizing on slide 6, I don't think this proposed update is going to necessarily incentivize nearby development to fill some of these gaps. That didn't come across to me. So either I didn't see the dot that you made, or I didn't connect the dots. So there may be one objective for this update that I don't quite see.
It
I
would
can
be,
see- Go ahead.
do you want me to try to answer that? It would
Yes,
be
please.
incentivized through offering TDT credit. And so in this example, so it's Blanton, it's a collector, it's eligible for TDT credit. Let's say a parcel diagonally across the street is going to redevelop one of those homes that maybe was built in the 60s. They would like to get TDT credit because they have a huge TDT bill they're going to have to pay. And so they might say, we're willing to do that sidewalk gap across the street.
And that's
exchange
where
for
that
TDT
1
credit.
mile came in.
And
Got
that's
it.
where that 1 mile analysis came in. So
Got it.
so that's
Got
our
it.
attempt to incentivize. I think you're absolutely right in characterizing that this is building improvements around the margin. It's not solving the systemic gaps, but I think that for people who would like to walk along, for example, Blanton Street, having that sidewalk gap filled could be a pretty nice thing to have for their community.
So if I could just summarize for myself, there's RNO 86-95, right? So point in time here.
Mhm.
Here we are today. You're making some policy update recommendations, right? Have there truly not been these kind of updates in that intervening time?
No, it is the same resolution and order that was adopted in 1986 that we're still using.
Okay, so, so that's where, you know, the additional multimodal support really comes through. In the laundry list on page 20, I don't see how ADA is fully contemplated there. Because it seems like the feds are,
Yeah, ADA is built into anything that gets built. So that's an add-on. So once the sidewalk or the curb ramp is conditioned, then the ADA dictates how that's built so that it's accessible.
okay, okay. It just seems like they've gotten a little bit more, for lack of a better phrase, stringent, where there were curb ramps before, but they weren't quite up to full standard, and a bunch of jurisdictions are having to go back and rework those.
Yeah, you're correct. The standards have changed. And so now we have curb ramps that were built in the past that are no longer compliant with the current ADA requirements.
Do our updates contemplate that appropriately?
So our inventory will capture the ramps that don't meet current standards. And so when we have that mile radius list,
Okay.
then those will show up. And so if a developer wants to rebuild ramps, then yeah, they would be eligible for the credit.
Okay, so ultimately where we're heading is there will be an RNO 2021 or 2022 that builds off of the 86-95 and fast forwards into where we're at now.
That's correct.
Okay, improvements, but not the holistic nature that I agree with Commissioner Rogers. We need to look at doing if we are indeed going to help be a more holistic community.
I think that's a correct characterization. It's not transformative, but it is within the current high level policies that have been set. So.
And I think this will be helpful too.
Yeah, and that's our objective. We're looking to try to make the best of what we have here and create some additional opportunities through this development process. I think, you know, in back to the three-legged stool, you know, that development constructed and those developer financial contributions to the system really are essential to sort of getting at that complete system that we're all hoping for at some point. But I think to your point earlier, yeah, you're right. We're not different from pretty much any other jurisdiction. We all have lots of incomplete sidewalk gaps and roadway gaps in our collective systems, and we've all got a big backlog to keep chipping away at.
All right, commissioners, any last thoughts, questions, or comments?
Yep, I have three. Could you go back to that slide a minute ago where you were laying out your proposed bullets of change, not this one,
I think that was slide 20.
whatever it was.
Yeah, that's slide 20.
Pulling that up. I'll make a comment on three of them that I think that maybe some work needs to be done. And I come at it from a different perspective, I understand, but we're retained the existing framework, continue to focus on safety evaluation rather than motor vehicle performance. I think you're going to see more motor vehicles, not less, especially with electrification, other types of vehicles. You haven't even seen the beginning of that. So I've listened to Hillsborough present various things. And that's why Hillsborough talks about capacity. If we get like you do in China or other countries that I've been to, where you have a lot of vehicles, they may not be cars as we think them. You know, they could be motor scooters. They could be lots of things. I think we need to think that through a little bit. In regard to what is it, 1, 2, 3, fourth one down, require larger developments to perform capacity analysis and identify mitigation options. I guess I have a little bit of heartburn, just personally, just me, that if we're trying to develop in a thoughtful way, why would anybody escape the requirement? I understand there's a capacity issue and somebody putting in 2 houses and they say, well, I can't do a lot, but there has to be some clarity as to what their responsibility and what they're contributing in terms of additional issues. So when you say that, larger developments only, it strikes me as a little bit odd. And then when you say reduced requirements for smaller development, I guess I don't have a clear understanding what that means. Again, if you have a standardized system you're trying to do and you're trying to enhance a multimodal system with active transportation included, I don't know how you reduce them. I mean, you got a standard. Everybody does the same thing. And I understand the nexus between how much they impact the system, but I don't get those 3 things.
Yeah.
So I compliment you're smart folks. We've had smart folks working on these very complex issues for a lot of years. I think we need to incorporate some city thoughts in this process as well, for the exact reason that Aaron, in your example, where you said, well, gee, the city may not have street signals on either end of that, but they're going to have turn lanes. How do we ever incentivize or encourage anyone to take on these unincorporated areas if we're building in such a way that they don't want them because their systems, they don't feel integrate with that they don't match up with their requirements? So I know you're doing it. I know you're good people and you're talking to the cities, but they talk a little different. And I don't have, I mean, I have a very broad understanding, but I don't have a very technical understanding of what exactly those differences are. So if again, and I'll pick on Hillsborough only because I've listened to their presentations the more over the years, and they've talked very specifically about capacity issues, very specifically about requiring turn lanes, very specifically about having certain widths on road because they're trying to do, think about the future. They need right of way, and that was brought up earlier. So I don't know how all that fits, and I just think we're kind of doing our thing, and they're kind of doing their thing, and we just keep on punting it down the field a little bit. But should we not say, and again, I don't mean to be preaching on this stuff, but shouldn't we be saying, let's plan for the vehicle performance issues? We're going to need it. Shouldn't we say all developments need to perform some kind of analysis? I'm sorry if you only build in one house. Maybe we figure out some incremental little. And as far as reducing requirements, I guess a bit of, personally, just me, a bit of a heartburn saying you're contributing to a system. How do you get reduced? If I get reduced because I'm only a house or 2, somebody else got to pay the tab down the line, and down the line never quite comes along. So to me, that's an issue. But Stephen, your staff's done excellent work. I'm not picking on them. I guess I get a little more philosophic about this.
Well, no, I appreciate your comments, Commissioner. And I think that I wanted to just touch on, and I realized that last bullet that says reduce requirements is probably a bit misleading. So we're really talking about reducing the level of safety analysis that might be required with our very smallest developments. It's always the same few things, improvements that are needed there. It's street lighting, improve the access, build the frontage improvements. And so we found that the analysis that we were asking those folks to do really had a very low return on investment. So the requirements for improvements are not being reduced. It's really just the requirements for some analysis with your development application. So that's definitely a thing that we could have worded probably a little bit better. And we'll take it as an action item to, as Aaron said earlier, we'll be going back and talking with the cities at the WCCC Technical Advisory Committee, I think, and continuing the conversation. And I think if I hear generally, I'm hearing there's a general level of support for moving forward with the policy as we've laid it out. Certainly, I think we all agree that Commissioner Rogers is raising some really relevant concerns, and those are some bigger picture issues that we shouldn't lose sight of. But I guess I'm maybe just looking for a head nod that we're prepared to go ahead and advance this proposal, at least for now.
Can I just add one clarifying point on that too? Just when we talk about system capacity, to be clear, the right-of-way dedication would not change. As Stephen said, the community development code still applies. The county's transportation system plan does tell us how many lane numbers on a link we need to see. So we're still getting the right amount of complete street width as a part of all developments, generally speaking. The real difference just comes in to that intersection capacity and so turn lane. So I'm not sure that people out in the community know the difference between a new development taking place in unincorporated county and a new development taking place in the city. They're functionally going to look really similar in that they're building site improvements, they're building sidewalks along their frontage, they're dedicating right of way. It just comes down to where we can require those additional capacity improvements at the intersections. And in
Aaron,
a
can
lot
I
of
follow-
cases, the county is still able to get those improvements as well.
Aaron, are sidewalk widths the same as all the cities, and are some abut, and that cyclists like that sometimes. They like that street bike lane. Others want to have a raised medium or a separation. So are we saying that all of our cities are very similar? Because that's not my understanding. They have very different ideas. And so
that's a part of
the
the
right away.
Yeah, that's a part of that complete streets design update that we've talked to you about. We'll be coming back to talk to you about again soon. There are differences in what we'd like to see as a part of our roads. The large county roads generally would follow our standards, although we're working with the cities on that. So you could see differences. There's just a lot of temporal things out there as well, though, where a road was built in 1998. It's going to look different than a road that was built in 2018. And it's going to look different when we go back in and build it in 5 years, probably. So there's just a lot of things that were developed at different times in the county. And that leads, I think, to some of the confusion, too, about what are the requirements and who built that way. Just has to do with when it was built.
All right. Oh, you're muted, Chair.
We've exceeded our time on this. Are there any last comments before we move away from transportation? Okay, well, thank you, Stephen, and your
Thank you all.
team. We
Great
shall move
conversation.
on now to the land of garbage. Different cast of characters now. There we go. Tom Eggleston, Marnie Kyle. Are we expecting anyone else?
Nope, I think this is it. So
Terrific. Welcome.
yeah, thank you. So thank you, Chair Harrington and board. I'm just going to turn it right over to Tom, who's going to spend the next hour-ish with you talking about two solid waste and recycling issues. So the first is the proposed amendments to the administrative rules, and the second is our garbage and recycling rate setting. So I'll turn it right over to Tom.
Thank you, Marnie. So as Marnie mentioned, good to see you all, Chair Harrington, commissioners. And we will start talking about our first topic this afternoon, which is the solid waste and recycling administrative rule proposed changes. If we get that presentation up, Clerk Moss, or whoever's navigating the PowerPoint.
The only presentation that I have from HHS was the garbage rates and recycling rates. So I will look for it real quick.
Oops.
If you look in the latest packet, there's a presentation for administrative rules. Topic 7, yesterday's packet. Starts at page 94 of 153 or so. I think.
I could go ahead and get us started just without the PowerPoint, if that works.
Yeah.
Everybody. It sounds like we have our packets near us or around us, so I'll kind of walk through it. So I'd like to start framing a little context. The solid waste and recycling administrative rules are essentially the document that guides the provision of garbage and recycling collection services in unincorporated Washington County. So we manage the collection service outside of the cities in urban and unincorporated Washington County. And these solid waste and recycling administrative rules essentially set the terms and conditions for which garbage service is provided. So our policy question this afternoon is to ask your board, should the solid waste and recycling administrative rules be amended to improve accessibility, enhance multifamily service standards, and generally update these rules?
Can somebody just give me presentation sharing capability and I can share the slides?
I'll send it to him.
They should be pulling it up shortly.
Yeah.
Page 143 of 202.
Here we go. Great, thank you for that. So there is the policy question before us today, really just kind of a general policy question about these rule amendments and whether your board supports them. So let's move to the next slide, please. A quick overview about the topics, the high level topic areas included in this proposed rule amendment. We have equity related considerations. We also have some multifamily, which are apartment communities and condo community, garbage and recycling service standards, and some general housekeeping updates. Next slide, please. On the equity topic, we have several areas that we are looking at addressing to increase the equitable outcomes of garbage service delivery. Just make sure that all community members are being treated fairly in the system and have access and opportunity to participate in it. One of those areas is adding some language at the beginning of the administrative rules document that really declares the intent of Washington County to use an equity lens in how it manages its garbage recycling system. Staff feels this is important to kind of put it on the record and put it in the rules so that we have some real guidance behind our application of the rules with an equity lens. Another area is personally identifiable information. We're looking to ensure that the types of personally identifiable information collected by service providers to either start or change garbage service does not carry with it unintended consequences for historically marginalized community members. Some examples of information that have been collected in the past or are collected by some providers include social security numbers and driver's license information. Staff received some complaints from community members that this is limiting access to garbage services, and we certainly don't have any types of need to have a social security card requirements in order to get garbage service in the county. So we worked with the Hauler Association to identify the minimum necessary pieces of it, personally identifiable information, and came to an agreement on what that information is and what it would be needed. Another area that we were working together with the haulers on is to include requirements that the certificated haulers require annual training of all their staff on bias reducing strategies, looking at ways to train staff about implicit bias, how it might impact their services, how it might impact their customer service, and how they can combat that in their service provision. Another area is kind of aligning with the county's LEAP planning efforts and ensuring that the services provided under a certificate to our community members meet all of the Title VI standards and requirements related to language accessibility. So ensuring that language translation services are available to community members, making sure they know they're available to them and they're available to them at no charge in all the safe harbor languages identified in the county's LEAP plan. Next slide, please. Moving on a little bit to the multifamily service standards section. A little bit of background about why we're adjusting multifamily service standards and not others at this time. So the 2030 Regional Waste Plan is Metro's regional waste plan, and it had identified a priority area to focus on apartment and condo communities where they have been historically underserved in the garbage system in the past. There's also Metro has made some rule and code change updates that require us to update our service standards to ensure that their services are being provided in accordance with those new standards at the Metro level. And it really does just ensure that collection services are more equitable for community members living in these multifamily settings where they don't have direct access to the customer relationship with the service provider. Next slide, please. Those proposed rule changes in specificity are setting minimum service levels for on a per unit basis to prevent lack of access to services. So we did some research with Metro and local government partners, and we found that some apartment communities are pretty chronically underserved, where community members have access to very little volume of garbage service. The average single family household gets between 35 and 60 gallons of service. And we found some multifamily properties with households having access to 10, 12, 15 gallons of service. A really bare minimum determined through that research would be 20 gallons per unit per week of garbage service, an equal 20 gallons per unit per week for recyclable materials, and 1 gallon per week for source separated glass recycling. Another standard in multifamily services would be to set color coding standards for bins to make them easier to identify and ensure consistency across the region. Another observation made in the field is that you go to one apartment community and the bins are green, and a different one and they're gray, and a different one and they're yellow or black. So this standard would require that garbage receptacles are gray or black, mixed recycling receptacles are blue, compostable materials receptacles are green, and glass are orange across the region consistently in every apartment community. And finally, complementary to that color coding matrix would be ensuring that all garbage and recycling bins are accurately and consistently labeled across the region. There's no, at this point, standard regional. Oh, Commissioner Willie, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, well, if I knew how to raise my hand properly, I'd do that. So just going back to those standards, bin colors and things like that. I mean, I read that and I said, that isn't the color of my bins in the city of Hillsborough. So if this is going to be kind of a county-wide metric, so we're going to give all the haulers the opportunity to transition to this. I mean, how's that going to work? Because that would seem to be kind of a significant cost.
Very good question. So the current service standards that Metro is guiding here are for multifamily services. So for apartment communities, single family garbage collection service like you might have at your household are not included in this. And there's multiple reasons. One of those is cost. There are a lot of bins in service, and it would be a pretty significant cost investment to change those out. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means that it needs more consideration. Multifamily garbage and recycling collection is underperforming in a sense, where the amount of garbage in the recycling is 3 to 4 times as much as what's in the single family household garbage system. So we're looking at finding ways to improve the accessibility and the infrastructure in that sector. The phase-in period is through 2028. So there is a 7-year phase-in period on this color coding requirement for multifamily containers. And that is in alignment with the depreciation schedule put into the rate setting processes. So it is not cost neutral. It will cost money to color code bins, to pull them out of service, paint them, and put them back into service, but that will be a cost that would be incurred over a 7-year period that lines up with the depreciation schedule. There are discussions about single family services and whether that should also be color coded. And I think that's a bigger conversation. And we're learning at the regional level that it's really important that if we make these kinds of decisions, we make them as a region, because color coding in unincorporated Washington County and not Hillsborough or not Forest Grove still creates this challenging situation where things are different in different localities. So it is really important to address this at a regional level. And I think the conversation is ongoing for single family homes at Metro in the future about whether or not those are also included. All right. Next slide, please. So some additional changes that are in these rule packet amendments. One of the reasons we're coming at this time is we have a business food scraps requirement that your board adopted in 2019, as you might remember, that requires certain large food generating businesses to collect food scraps separate from garbage. The start date for that program was March 31st, 2020. And something happened in the middle of March 2020 that spurred us to pause. And at the regional level, Metro hit the brakes on the food scraps requirement and said, we can't implement this in the middle of COVID. Let's delay it by a year. And then we subsequently delayed it another year. So the new implementation date at the regional level for this program is March 31st, 2022. And instead of writing hard dates into our rules, we are trying to take the approach now of pointing to the Metro administrative rule that signals the start date so that we can be aligned with the region and make sure that our rules are still relevant. So that's a technical change that's in there. Another area that is being adjusted is mist collections. Our mist collection services are very tailored around inclement weather, such as snow and ice storms. So referring to school closures and hazardous driving conditions. When we were faced with the air quality concerns last summer, we experienced some difficulty understanding our rules and applying them to a different situation. So we're trying to step back and take more of an all hazards approach to service interruptions and consider things like worker safety and not just road conditions in when services are curtailed or interrupted. Another area is vacation credits. There's a lot of confusion always around what's a vacation credit and what's stopping and starting your service. So there's a little bit of area to clarify some of that. And other edits are pretty minor, kind of related to the bin colors. We had have a historical requirement in our rules that bins for yard debris would have green lids by 2023. And we're actually proposing to walk that back a little bit because we've learned through the Metro process that it doesn't really, it takes more than a lid, and just color coding one stream of materials is not necessarily meeting our outcomes and goals, and that we really need to take this on at the regional level. So instead of investing in or asking the haulers to invest in green lids, we're going to walk that back and try to take a more intentional approach in this proposal. I think that's it for this slide. Is that the last slide too? Oh, stakeholder engagement. So we did take these rules to the Garbage and Recycling Advisory Committee on April 8th of this year, and they voted unanimously to recommend your board approves them. We have been working with the Washington County Haulers Association for the last 7 or 8 months on these rules and really worked through all the nitty-gritty details to make sure that they are not too onerous or too burdensome, and they generally are not unsupportive of any of them, and they feel that they can be adequately implemented. And city and regional partners, we have worked with our city partners. We collaborated with the city of Hillsborough on the personally identifiable information, and then we've worked really closely with Metro on all the regional requirements. And next slide, that is it for my rules. Any questions, please? Thank you.
Commissioners, questions and comments? Who would like to go first? Or if you don't have anything, that's fine too. Okay, I know I have a couple questions, so I'll just dive right in and see if there's any after that. Tom, going back to the slide that's titled Multifamily Service Standards. So when you talk about the 20 gallons per unit per week for garbage, so at our single family homes, not multifamily homes, we have roll carts. In various, multifamily units come, or multifamily areas, neighborhoods come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. So some use roll carts, others use the containers. So will these color standards apply to both those cases where roll carts are used, as well as cases where containers of various sizes are used? And
Yes,
I don't know if I'm using the right phrase, container versus, that big hunkin' metal thing.
You are actually using the exact right phrase per our rules. Container is the large front load dumpster, and roll cart is the cart. So, so the multifamily is defined as 4 or more connected units. So a fourplex is a multifamily complex, and these rules would apply to a fourplex. So if a property manager was providing service in carts to a fourplex in roll carts, they would need to be color coded. Yes.
But if they're the metal containers?
Yes, as well.
Okay.
Yep.
Did you get pushback around the capital costs for that and transition time, or is there a transition time that I just didn't notice when I scrolled through the admin rules?
Yeah, so the phase-in period is between now and 2028. And Metro did do a pretty comprehensive public engagement process, and that one area of pushback from the regional service providers was the cost of equipment replacements. So they did some analysis. Metro did some reviews on different approaches to address that, and this 8-year or 7-year phase-in period was one of the approaches to kind of mitigate some of those effects.
Okay, thank you. And then the other Yeah, I think it was in the rules, though I didn't write down the page. So I'm going off of memory here because I didn't write a specific enough note. I think I noticed that the racial bias training is required annually. Now, I can certainly see how if they have a change of personnel, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe given human nature, annually is a good idea as well. I was just wondering if the requirements for that are based off of best practices, known best practices, or just someone's common sense. Do you know?
So we did a lot of research across the region on these kind of incorporating equity into our rules and regulations. This is largely borrowed from practice in the city of Portland. And the types of trainings, they are really the city staff, and I envision in our situation, county staff would really work closely with the Washington County Hauler Association to identify appropriate trainings. And we tried to not just focus on racial bias, but think about other bias reducing strategies in general. So looking at all different modalities of biases and how they affect service provision. So essentially really looking at bias and how that incorporates and how that affects our businesses and our customer service facing, I think, aspects of our businesses is the intent there.
Okay, thank you. Helpful. Those were all the questions I had. Go ahead, Commissioner Willie.
Yeah, just as you were talking, Chair, about the 20 gallons per unit for the garbage, and I'm thinking of a condo that my wife and I own in the Tannisbourne area, and it's a fairly large complex, and so we just got one little piece of it. But I do remember at different times when we've gone over there that the containers were generally pretty full, and so is this going to require that if they have to allow for 20 gallons per unit per week for garbage for their individual condos or apartments that are in there, does that mean they're going to have to expand where they have these? Because they have them, they always build these nice little houses and they put the containers inside these, and there's a couple of garbage ones and there's a recycle one. So is this going to require possibly for them to have to allow for an expanded service by having this criteria of 20 gallons per unit?
Are you thinking about like the enclosure or the garbage room area, making it bigger physically?
Yes.
Yes, so that is a challenge we face a lot, especially with existing building stock that's older. We're pretty confident, Metro's pretty confident that these standards are not going to themselves trigger much need to do physical improvements. There's many ways to achieve the service volume. You could increase frequency of collection. So if it's collected 3 days a week right now, they could increase that to 5 days a week and adjust the container sizes themselves and makeup. So there's a lot of ways to do it. Metro's code language that they adopted in alignment with the regional waste plan does include a project that is on another 2-year time frame to evaluate enclosure standards and really update regional requirements on what is an adequate garbage and recycling enclosure. And we deal with those in our design review for major remodels and new developments, and trying to understand how big of a garbage area does this apartment community need or this building need. And that's a challenge and a struggle because everything's so unique. So there is going to be some work over the next couple of years to kind of work that issue out and really identify what's the best solution going forward to ensure that access is available.
Yeah, I would like to think that realizing Metro is the Tri-County region, at least we in Washington County, we would want to at least make sure we have communication with those larger apartment complexes so we're not creating a real burden for them and making these changed requirements. So.
Absolutely. And we have staff that actually provide on-site technical assistance to apartment communities. They help them provide education to tenants, help them work with their garbage providers to really understand what are the options available to them. So we're hoping to really support property managers as these rules are kind of rolled out.
Good job, Tom.
All right, thank you. So we'll be back on the 22nd of June with an action item for these administrative rules.
Terrific.
All right.
And now we're going to move on to some money.
Money, talk about rates. All right, so rate review. This is the meatier topic, and we'll try to get through it as we can. So next slide, please. So we have two policy questions here today to talk about on the rate review topic. First question is, should the garbage and recycling rates be adjusted to allow a 10% return on revenue for certificated haulers? And the second question is, should additional rate adjustments be made to offset increased disposal expenses from a metro tip fee increase? So those are kind of our two main questions. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is an overview of the rate review process. I put numbers next to each one of these steps. I would like to use animation, but I can't use that until I'm in person. So next year we'll have an animated process. First, in kind of a little bit of background, I think is important. I think all you know this. These are the collection rates that are set for garbage and recycling collection in unincorporated Washington County for urban and rural customers. So the cities set their own rates and services. And just like the admin rules, we also set garbage rates in unincorporated Washington County. So we have 9 private solid waste collection companies that provide these services. And on March 15th of every year, they are due to report to us in a detailed cost reports that we receive on the 15th of March. After we receive those cost reports, we go to step 2, where we kind of look over those reports, and we're really looking for accuracy and consistency. We look for data that was reported last year versus this year. If there's some really significant changes, it's probably a typographical error, and we'll work with the haulers to correct those. And we also identify 5 of the 9 haulers, and we pull them out of the system, out of the group, and we do an in-depth review with our CPA firm, Marina and Company. They, in a normal year, would do some on-site work where they actually go on site to the offices and look for supporting documentation to support some of the data in the DCRs. Once that process is completed, we make any adjustments necessary. Some of those adjustments might include adjusting truck hours if driver hours don't match truck hours, so that trucks aren't driving themselves in the data. Also looking at disposal costs if they don't match published disposal rates, just data we know that can be adjusted and defended. We also offer the haulers back the proposed adjustments and give them the opportunity to provide additional information to support the original documentation. Once it's consolidated, the data is, we determine a system return on revenue. Once the system return on revenue is determined, we look at what adjustments might be necessary to meet the target return on revenue. So if it comes in low, we would look at what adjustments would needed to return it higher. If it comes in high, we'd look at what adjustments would need to bring it down. We then take those adjustments and recommendations to the Garbage and Recycling Advisory Committee. They make a recommendation to your board, and we bring those adjustments to your board, and then your board takes action, and then finally those rates are adjusted for community members. Next slide, please. So some rate review practice. These are the practices that go into this process. The target return on revenue is currently 10%. That's been in place since about 2013. Prior to that, we were on a glide path to 10 coming out of the recession in 27, 28. Actual expenses are used to evaluate the return on revenue. We don't really look at future projections. We don't project fuel futures. We don't project healthcare increases. We look back at the previous full calendar year and use that data to estimate and determine what the return on revenue was for the system that year. There is one exception there. If there's a significant and known and measurable future cost, we would consider that as well. We have 5 service providers that I mentioned earlier that are selected for in-depth reviews that include site visits. We do make adjustments for discrepancies. So if there's data that just doesn't line up or we can't explain it, we would adjust it back to an average or a median that is defendable and explainable. Rates that are set out of rate review are intended to cover the costs that are missing from the system over a 12-month period. So if we set rates on July 1st, 2021, we would expect the system to have recovered the missing or the revenue short of their targets through the next 12 months. And we use a cost of service model to set rates. So each line of service, residential service, commercial service, and Dropbox service all support their own cost of service. We don't subsidize between those systems. Next slide, please. So now let's look at the results of this year's annual rate review. This year, the collection system is 2020 now, excuse me. Collected about $31.7 million in revenue and earned about $2.25 million in income or profit. That puts the return on revenue at about 7.1%. So that is short of the target 10%. When we break that down by line of service, we see that the residential sector earned a return on revenue at 4.15%, which is significantly lower than 10. And commercial and Dropbox actually overperformed and earned above 10. This tells an interesting story, and I think it's COVID is definitely we see the impacts here. In the data, we saw that there was much more disposal cost in the residential sector, much more truck hours in the residential sector, much more driver and labor hours dedicated to the residential sector. And that really can be explained by more materials being at the curb, heavier cans, more extra setouts, more cars and traffic in neighborhoods, more people on the streets. And I think that is can be partially explained by the fact that we've spent so much time at home over the last 18 months during COVID. Next slide, please. If we're looking at what adjustments would be needed to meet this 10% return on revenue, we're looking at the residential sector being short about $1.3 million, which would equate to a 6.5% rate change. And that's about $1.52 per month for the average residential customer in a 32-gallon cart. Commercial, we would actually need to pull 125,000 out of the system, a decrease of 2%, and for Dropbox, 164,000 out of the system at about 3% decrease. Next slide, please. This year, we do have a significant known and measurable cost that is going to be incurred in the future. On July 1st, 2021, Metro will be increasing its disposal fees by about $16.80 per ton, which is about a 17% increase. Metro went through a rate review process similar to the one we do for their disposal services at the end of 2020, and they found that their tonnage was down in their transfer station systems and their expenses were flat or even up in some cases, and that they were having a revenue shortfall. So they addressed that through various means. They did some budget cuts. They drew down some rate stabilization reserves, and they also had to take a rate increase. And that increase will take effect July 1st, and the haulers will start paying that at the transfer stations on that date. Looking at what that will mean to what cost that will have to the haulers over the next 12 months, we're estimating that it's going to cost about $1 million for the residential sector in increased disposal costs and about $380,000 for the commercial sector. And you can kind of see the commensurate increases. Yes, Commissioner Willie.
Well, I'm a little confused. I thought I heard you say that since all of us were staying home and eating at home more, that the tonnage of garbage had actually increased, which would actually increase the amount of disposal fees that Metro received, wouldn't it?
Well, not necessarily. The garbage really tracks the economy. So when economic activity slows down, garbage rates drop down and go down too. And I think what we saw in the residential sector with increased tonnage was largely a shift of materials from the commercial sector to the residential sector. So inverse to the residential sector being stuffed full, cans stuffed full of garbage and extra setouts, I would say that the commercial sector was likely bins that were half empty and didn't have as much material in them because there wasn't as much activity in the business community.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Next slide, please. So in this year's rate review, we took the exercise of combining these two factors together, which makes this a very complex year to really look at these combined impacts. This table attempts to kind of combine the pieces of the last two tables you saw. So the residential sector, for the annual rate review to return the target 10%, we saw we needed a 6.5% increase. And on the Metro fee increase side, it was a 4.9%. So you add those together and we're at about 11.5%, which is $2.66 per month for the average residential customer. On the commercial side, we started with the need to actually draw down rates by about 2%. And then we're faced with a 6% increase from the disposal fees. And that really does buy down that increase to about 4% or about $11 per month for a business with a 4-yard container, which is generally a pretty small business. And Dropbox, the disposal fee on Dropbox is actually a pass-through and our rates don't account for that. So we would be looking at proposing a rate decrease for Dropbox of about 3%, which is about $4 for a haul charge on a Dropbox. Next slide, please. We did take a look at some of the trends over the last 15 years and tried to map out where rates have been and what the target return on revenue has been. You can see the red line on the screen there is the target. It was at about 8% before the recession, and it was bouncing around between 8.5%. There was some work to move on a glide path to 10% after the recession coming out, and that result of some negotiations for some different approaches. And I think part of that is not projecting future costs, but really looking at hard previous costs. The target has been 10% for a while. The blue line you can see is the actual performance in return on revenue. You can see that on the left side of the screen, the blue line was performing really high right before the recession, and then it got hit pretty hard, went below the target. And then some on the green line on the bottom is some rate actions that were attempted to bring that line back up above the target return on revenue. You can also see on the green lines some of the big adjustments in 2017. That was the recycling surcharge that was a result of the national sword policy from China when they stopped buying recyclables. And I think it actually shows that that surcharge worked because we don't see a commensurate jump in the blue line where they over-earned the following year. So the surcharge really did pay for a new increased cost and kind of leveled out the effect of that policy. Next slide, please. So we are presenting 4 options here to talk about the general rate processes. Option 1 would be to adjust the return on revenue to 10% and include the metro disposal fee. And that's kind of the chronology of what I just walked through in those analyses. Option 2 would be, and also there's a handout in your work session packet. And in that handout, it lays out exactly what the different rate impacts each of these options would have on the system or on the customers. Option 2 would be to adjust the return on revenue to 10% with standard practice and not including the future metro disposal fee increase. Another option could potentially be not to adjust the return on revenue to 10%, leave it where it's at or a different target, and to include the metro disposal fee increase. There are lots of options in front of your board. And of course, there's always the option not to do anything, which staff wouldn't recommend it. Next slide, please. Just because it's not really complex enough, there's a couple more things to identify. We have some additional rate adjustments that we're proposing in this year's rate review. The first one is kind of following through on some work that was done in early 2020 that was delayed because of COVID related to the business food scraps collection requirement. We had done some work with the advisory committee and your board in work session to arrive at a policy decision to include food scraps in the collection service businesses receive. So just like you sign up for garbage service as a business, you get recycling as part of that bundled package. We're also planning to include food to that bundled package to kind of support the implementation of the food scraps collection requirement. We're proposing that in line with the new start date for that policy, we would go ahead and bundle that service effective March 31st, 2022. And actually, I think the date we would shoot for is April 1st because we don't want to have one day on and off month for billing purposes. We're also looking at a additional yard debris cart rate and adjusting that from $1.50 per month to $4.25 per month, which sounds like a really big increase. But we were looking back at some history in 2017. The system was overperforming and it was earning more than the target revenue. And one approach to take some of that revenue out of the system was to take this rate down to $1.50 per month. That caused some inverse rate incentives that made getting an extra cart for your yard debris cheaper than just setting out some extra yard debris next to your cart. So the haulers were experiencing some customers with 20 or 30 carts that wanted them only for leaf season. And it was really challenging for them to service those accounts. And that's really the intended purpose of the extra bag, not adding the extra service component. So instead of adjusting rules and requiring service subscriptions or service commitments, we decided to try to take it through rate incentives and to kind of control that behavior of ordering that equipment and going back to the right rate for that service. And then finally, adding a container cleanout fee. Right now, businesses that collect food scraps receive one free container swap or clean out every year to make sure they get a fresh bin so it doesn't get too stinky. They can request additional cleanouts if they need them, but there's no set rate. So some providers are charging a little bit different rates than other providers. So we agreed that there needs to be a really set established rate. And the haulers provided some analysis based on costs to remove containers, serve them, clean them, and bring them back. And we landed at about $16 per occurrence, which we feel is reasonable and in line with what other jurisdictions like Hillsborough charge. So next slide, please. We're almost done, I promise. I feel like I've been talking the whole time. Garbage and so some stakeholder engagement. We did take these this rate package to the Garbage and Recycling Advisory Committee at their May 13th meeting. They did vote to recommend that your board adopt the proposed rates laid out in option 1, which is adjusting to 10% and incurring the Metro disposal fee increase, as well as supporting the additional rate adjustments we just mentioned. And we have been working with the Washington County Haulers Association throughout rate review. We work really closely with them and their consultants to conduct rate review, and they are also supportive of the resulting recommendations. Next slide, please. So our recommendations summed up here are that staff does recommend option 1, which is to adjust the return on revenue to 10% and include the Metro disposal fee. Staff prefers this option because it does maintain current practice and agreed upon measures with the Washington County Haulers Association. It also offsets these increased costs from the disposal fee increase. And if we feel if we don't take it on, it's going to compound and become a bigger problem later. And if we do see future rate increases at Metro, say next year or the year after that, and we're still playing catch up from previous ones, we might get in a position where we're chasing those disposal fee increases. And we also, kind of speaking to that, we feel like if we take this increase now, it reduces the likelihood to continue to need to take more increases in the future that might be larger than they would otherwise be. So upon this recommendation, that would mean that if this recommendation was approved by your board, that would mean that effective July 1st, 2021, there'd be an 11.4% increase for residential rates, 4.2% increase for commercial rates, a 3% decrease for compactor rates. The additional yard debris cart would be adjusted to $4.24 per month. And there would be a commercial container clean out fee of $16 per month added to the rate sheet. And finally, effective March 31st or April 1st, 2022, food scraps collection would become a bundled service with garbage and recycling. And that is the last slide. I'm happy to answer questions.
Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
Thank you. Could you please go back to slide 8? When we talk about the different options, can we speak about these as a bundle? And what I'm asking is, could we not reduce the Dropbox fee and in turn lower the residential increase? I mean, is that a possibility, or
yes? So
how much would it impact? I don't know what the comparison is.
So that is definitely an option. There's nothing that really says everything here needs to be done a certain way or set in stone. The code really gives the board direction to set fair, reasonable, and at appropriate rates. How what that means is up to interpretation by your board. Our practice has been not to have different lines of service subsidize each other. So essentially, our practice has been that residential should pay for residential, commercial should pay for commercial, and Dropbox should pay for Dropbox. That in the past, there has been some precedent where commercial was earning 12, 13% return and residential was earning 7 or 8% return. So in theory, that means that the commercial sector was subsidizing the rate for the residential sector. So we've undone that in the current rate model. That doesn't mean it can't be put back in there or redone and worked back out into the future. If you go back 2 slides, maybe, I can answer the second part of that question. So if you're asking what effect would that have on the rate and the system?
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
See here the magnitude of those numbers.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay, that answers your question. Thank you.
Yep.
Darn.
Can I go ahead?
Willie? Sorry.
I was gonna say, did you take a nap or something that I missed in there?
No, I opened a seltzer water and I double muted because I didn't want to have any impact on you. And instead ta-da.
That's okay. Yeah, right. I'm sorry. So Thomas, I think I am not a fan of option number 1. And so I have had conversations with you and proposed a blend. Actually, in your first presentation, when you came to us a while back, you had 4 options, I believe. And I didn't care for any of those very much, so we kind of blended one. And I guess for you to say, and I don't mean for you, I guess for the concept is that each one of these lines of service has to stand on their own, I don't believe is realistic. They're all provided by the same hauler. So each hauler does all 3 of these. And as each one of us who have owned and ran their own businesses know, that there are, when you provide different lines of service, if you want to talk about that in the accounting industry, certainly individual tax returns versus corporate tax returns versus nonprofits versus audits, all of those things are blended together at the end of the day to see how profitable the company is. And then if you have to make rate adjustments, you do bifurcate those and separate them apart and see where the adjustment should be and should not be. But the overall impact is the profitability of the company at the end of the day. And that's what I think this hauler industry probably has a mindset as well. I mean, they probably look at these commercial and drop box profits and say, okay, we probably don't need to make as much adjustment here, but we need to bring residential up. I don't disagree with that either. And as I've communicated to you, the metro fee increase of was $16.80 a ton. Is that what you said that was? I can't remember what the number was. Yeah, $16.80 per ton. I mean, and the fact that you said we don't know what they're going to do in the future. So who do they answer to? I mean, I know Metro Council approves it, but there has to be some sensitivity to a 17% increase in these fees and the impact region-wide to the consumer. And so it would seem to me like there should be, there probably is accountability somewhere up and down the food chain that Metro can't increase these rates 17% a year. We've got to figure out something else. So anyway, bottom line is I don't agree with option number 1, and I would like to suggest we look at something else.
Did I hear you correct, Commissioner Willie, that you also said you didn't like any of the prior 4 options either?
Well, there was, I think it was option 4 that I was closest to, but again, I don't have those in front of me. And so I actually thought they were going to be proposed today. I didn't know we were going to just have one recommendation. So,
I asked for that clarification because I laughed earlier. I might have been muted, but nonetheless, I laughed because I thought the bottom line of all of that is you're not happy with any of the options, and I don't quite know where to go with that.
Well, let's just say, Thomas, refresh my memory here. Would you and I have talked about this, and I've got your emails in front of me, but I don't have like I said, I don't have the 4 options in there, so I can't remember, but it seems to me if number 4 was no change, then I didn't like number 4. And if number 3 was some sort of a blend of,
well, I'm not trying to make us go backwards because we did make progress and had a majority that said go forward. And I really want us to go forward as opposed to have to replow that ground again. I mean, if we're going to replow it, then we have to go all the way back and redo that whole work session. And that's not what we have before us today.
well, I understand that, but that we also don't just have one option today.
Yeah, and Commissioner Willie, some of the what you asked for and what you might be referring to was you asked if we could do the numbers on some alternative options, and those were essentially not necessarily trying to work to achieve a 10% return, but you asked if they're good, what would it be if it was an 8% or a 9% or even a 7%? And so those might have been the options you're thinking about, that you were asking about. And I don't know if you're expressing those weren't necessarily satisfactory to you either.
So maybe here's where I was going with that. The metro fee increase, I believe, on the residential side should be covered in a fee increase on the residential cost, okay? And then currently they are performing at a, what was the percent?
So it's 4.15 for the residential sector, but 7.1 overall.
Yeah. So I didn't have too much of an issue with increasing the residential side of things to bring them up to a closer standard, although maybe not all the way to 10%, but certainly a closer standard. On the commercial side of things, they are exceeding the 10%. I'm not advocating that we reduce that, but maybe we absorb that extra 2% that they're over the 10%, and we reduce the metro fee increase that we're willing to allow. So to get them to back to 10%, we would just not cover 100% of the metro fee increase. And then the drop box is kind of the drop box. Those fees pass through, and I don't think we make any recommendations on the drop box. Is that correct, Thomas?
Yeah, so the Dropbox was about 12.6%, and we were proposing a decrease of about 3% just to return it to 10. But the disposal doesn't affect that rate because the rate does not include disposal costs in it. And that's a pass-through cost for the customer.
Okay.
So on slide 5, I'm just trying to make sure I understand the numbers you and Commissioner Willie were looking at. Yeah, so, and commercial waste can be disposed of at the Metro transfer station as well, right?
Yes, so the assumption in the rate models we use is that all tons go through that fee structure, essentially because we don't necessarily know what the private disposal rates are. And we use the Metro disposal rate as the price signal, the price leader.
So what Commissioner Willie is advocating for is hold the, if I understand it correctly, because it's happening in real time, hold the commercial rates and the Dropbox rates, only allow for changes to the residential rates, but not necessarily to a 10% level. Am I understanding that proposal correctly?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. I believe that is correct. Yeah, I think it's only fair that we have residential closer to this 10% level. And again, Thomas, you've indicated you don't combine them all together, but you've given us a total system evaluation of 7.1%. So if we said we want to take the total system to a 10%, what would that look like?
With commercial and Dropbox continuing to be over 10%, so residential would be a little bit under, is what you're asking?
Yes.
Yes, we could do that math and share that for certain.
Well, I think what all this boils down to is there's some kind of proposal that Commissioner Willie is making or would like to make, and I'm going to need you and he to put that down on paper before I'm willing to entertain it on June 22nd. I'm not going to try and understand it anymore here.
And I completely agree with you, Chair. Thomas and I have been sharing several emails back and forth and communication back and forth about that. And I apologize that maybe I should have clarified and had at least that as an option too on there. So that's on me. And I'll be glad to work with Thomas, and we'll get to that number, and we'll get back to the commission as soon as possible. Is that fair?
Yes, and we won't be able to hit our July 1st target date, but that is not, again, that's just a target date. So if we need to push it back to get it right, then that's certainly something we can do, and just hold to do more analysis and make sure your board's comfortable with the rate.
Well, I'm just saying he's within his right to put together a proposal. I'm not saying I'm going to be voting to support said proposal. So just to be clear, I still want to weigh in on the recommendation here today. But first, I'll see if other commissioners have questions or comments first. Or I can dive right in, whatever.
I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I prefer option one. I don't like to have these increases kicked down the road, but that's just me. The only thing Jerry, I might disagree with you where you're saying that, you're using an accounting analysis of, you might be doing different things for the same client or a series of clients. Not everybody's in the same garbage disposal route. I mean, you might have your business in a carrier that's only doing the commercial side, and you may have your personal in a very different one. So this gets very complex real quickly when you say that we're assuming that somehow they're blending rates. And I think that maybe staff did a little bit of, create a little bit of confusion, let's put it that way, by trying to blend a rate and say we're trying to come up with something overall. Some rates, we all know, or some routes are very profitable if they're close together. I can think of like a King City route where your houses are real close and they can service them. More rural routes are much more expensive because of the distances. Some have a lot of commercial rate that they receive just because of the routes. Others have very little. So I can certainly support Commissioner Willie's idea to take a look at it. I just don't know that I'll arrive at anything other than option one, just because of the complexities of it. And so Jerry, that would be my comments. I think it's a little more complex than staff has laid out.
Commissioner Fye, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I think to further complicate this topic and this conversation in front of us, I prefer option one. And this conversation is really new in my head, in my memory, because I had a briefing yesterday with our staff. Thank you, Thomas and Marty and Mira, for that great presentation. I learned a lot. I've asked a lot of questions about why now. We are, my concern and why I support option one is we are in a pandemic, and I am concerned of exacerbating further stresses, especially financial stresses of the pandemic. And also, one thing I learned yesterday is that we're having this conversation not because of a mandated rule or procedure. It's just a practice that exists in Washington County to annually review this and to increase or not increase the rates. So it's really not an obligation. It's just a practice. And I think we have a moral responsibility to protect our community and our residents and to make sure we're not adding more stresses. And I feel like right now, if we were to vote a different option and increase the rates, we would impact. And I honestly, we use the CARES fund and we will use the ARPA money to pay utilities and assist families and people who need assistance with utilities, whether garbage or electricity or any of that, to help them mitigate some of their financial stresses. So isn't that counterproductive if we're increasing yet we're using the American Rescue Funds to help people? Okay, hold on, mommy. Excuse about background. somebody needs more ice cream. So I'll be short and brief to say I like option one because it's just not, right now is not the right time.
So Commissioner Fye, I think it's worth, I need to point out that option one is, would it result in a larger rate increase than the other options? So if your objective is not to actuate a larger rate increase onto customers, you would want to be looking at one of the other options. Oh, and you're on mute.
I noticed that, and I was reviewing the document that's in the material posted, and option one would maintain current correct?
Practice.
Yeah, current practice, which is not increasing the rate. Is that how I have
Well,
it?
current practice would be to increase the rates.
Oh, I see. Because it said maintain current review practices. I assumed meant not changing the rate.
No, apologize if that language was confusing.
It means maintaining the current model of cost of service and continuing to support the 10% rate of return.
Yeah, so I'm choosing. So I'm choosing we go for not increasing the rate.
I'm not sure that
is an option.
That's
Right.
probably option 4, which is to do nothing, no change. That would leave the rates where they are now.
So we gave direction a couple of weeks ago, didn't we?
No, we've had one-on-one briefings, but this is the
Okay.
first work session. And we're
So now
scheduled.
you brought all 4 options back on the table without us having the reminder slide that there were 4 options.
Well, I raised my hand a couple times to suggest that we put that slide with the 4 options up.
Yeah, sorry to confuse everyone. I think since I had the last briefing, I was referring. So, thank you, Marty.
Okay, well, I'd like to share my thoughts because we've had 4 commissioners have the opportunity to share their questions and thoughts so far. My first thought is this topic's going to have to come back to us with a presentation that lays out what the options are and the recommendations. Because we got half information today than in the presentation. So, but irrespective of that, I did some homework before I had my briefing with staff. And I'm glad I did that homework because it reminded me that the Metro Council had reviewed their cost structure in the second half of last calendar year and had a work session in December, and then by resolution adopted a new rate proposal that would be effective 6 months later. So no one can say this is a surprise per se. The other thing is that I had to remind myself that it's a new system now as of 2020. And Metro had chosen to not go through rate review last year because of COVID. And so we're now catching up with the new system. And what that means is the old system was that 90% of the region's tonnage was guaranteed to waste management. Now the current system is one where Metro transfer stations are to be provided only 40% of the region's waste volume. We all know, though it bears repeating, that Metro transfer stations provide a wider range of service than any other transfer stations private transfer stations are all the other ones. The metro transfer stations provide more lines of service than all the other transfer stations do. So they have more services for cost coverage than any other. In addition, they have regional policies around equity and those levels of service to be covered than anybody else. So they've had a lower volume because of COVID. They've had a lower level of tonnage that has flowed through their two transfer stations. So the overall tonnage in the region may have gone up, but it certainly wasn't up at the two metro transfer stations. So lower waste volume has been down, fixed costs for the critical public services, therefore are spread over a smaller amount of waste. They did, thankfully, do some cost saving cuts, which were hard for them to do, but they did them for us, as well as drawing from reserves. So they have tried to contain the cost increase to us. We also, as a region, have relied upon their litter patrol, their RID patrol, reduce illegal dumping. So they've got some new programs going on. The reason why I mention all of that is because it is a significant rate increase for the disposal side. You know, we'd be having probably a very different discussion if it wasn't such a significant increase, but it is. So ultimately, that puts a further pinch on our current policy or our current practice of looking at rates of return on a line of service as opposed to a blended service. Remember, Thomas talked earlier about individual lines of service and no subsidy across those lines of service. Commissioner Rogers is also spot on that these franchise hauling areas are different size areas and have a different composition. No two are alike. By virtue of miles traveled, households covered, residences covered, businesses covered, drop box utilization. And this is one reason why I think the line of service model has strength, because not all lines of service are used at the same level of frequency across the different areas of our county, or at least for the unincorporated areas of the county. So for all those various reasons, hard though it may be, I am in support of option one, to maintain the current rate review practice, to make sure that we are recognizing the increased costs with the disposal fee, and try to reduce the likelihood of a large future increase. You know, we have this delayed change to a new system, as well as the impact of COVID, and we've got to move forward. If we just peanut butter around, we're going to continue to spread pain over a longer period. And when we look at the individual household increases, it's not the percent increases that, I mean, there are numbers in here for everybody's story, But if you look at the impact to a residential customer, that goes back to slide 12. It's not the percentage so much that I'm worried about at all for the residential rate. I think it won't be so bad. So anyway, that's where I stand. I'm with Commissioner Rogers on option 1. And I can't tell where Commissioner Treese is. I only knew she had a question from before. Go ahead, Commissioner. Oh, she's holding up her finger 1. She's with option 1 as well. So I think what you've got thus far is you've got a majority of 3 willing to move forward with option 1. You have Commissioner Willie, who is going to continue to come up with a different proposal, one that blends lines of service, if I understood him correctly, versus continue with the individual lines of service. And Commissioner Fye doesn't want to see any cost coverage rate increase. Go ahead, Commissioner Willie.
Yeah, and I'll be quick. I know I don't want to drag this out any longer. I've already sent my recommended proposal to Thomas and Marnie. It is I'm somewhere between you and Commissioner Fye on I think an 11% residential rate increase is excessive, and I don't think we should do that. And so I have, like I said, I've sent my recommendation to those 2, and Thomas will run his numbers, and then we'll get back to it.
So
yeah, I think there's a better answer than one.
It still doesn't make it public for the rest of us. So
no, it's remember, we're just playing with numbers at this point in time. So when we get it down to a little bit more fine tooth, then we'll be glad to put it out in public and send it out to you as well.
So we're deliberating towards a decision. Our just final action won't be till the June 22nd. So it just means that none of us can talk about this with one another until that meeting, right? Then we have a quorum issue. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Can I get Tom, and just one really fast, percentages are, you can make people draw conclusions. The amount of increase is less than $3 a month.
Yeah.
So why don't you cite it on the residential side?
What's that?
Can you say what it is?
Yeah, the $2.66 for the average customer per month.
Yep.
So it's not even a McDonald's hamburger and pop. It's less than that. Okay.
Well, remember, Roy, we've had this conversation a year ago for 50 cents. So
I agree.
Generally isn't the money, okay? And the second thing, the second part to that is that you talk about there's a difference in costs to run garbage from out more in the rural areas where it's less dense as is the cities, but they've compensated for that in their rates, because the rate in North Plains is $70 and my rate in Hillsborough was $53. So the haulers make those cost adjustments in the fees they charge. It has actually nothing to do with what we recommend as a fee increase. So just try and keep that in mind as well. They're not all the same rate.
No, I appreciate that point. Both of those examples were inside cities. And I know King City has its own, and Tigard and Tualatin. So I understand they're all different. We're looking at the urban unincorporated as well as rural areas. So, yeah, but I respect your point.
In our rate structure, rural community members, so living outside of the urban growth boundary or the metropolitan service district boundary, don't receive yard debris service because they have huge lots and it wouldn't be an appropriate service for a 60-gallon roll cart, and they pay a little bit more for their service than their urban counterparts do, and that's largely because of the time between stops. So as you mentioned, it takes a lot longer to drive between those stops. So there is those differences in the rate structure.
So it's not our responsibility to ensure that the city rates are in line with the urban the unincorporated rates, nor is it vice versa. So, you know, I can't speak to why North Plains has a rate, right? I do know, I think that Hillsborough, city of Hillsborough uses blended lines of service, and maybe the other cities all do as well. The practice in Washington County for unincorporated Washington County has been individual lines of service. And I haven't heard a good argument for changing that yet.
Chair Harrington, can I just recap next steps? So next steps is this is currently scheduled for the June 22nd meeting as an action item. Any additional materials we receive from commissioners, we'll make sure that those are included in the public packet.
Yep. So right now we have 3 commissioners who seem comfortable with option 1, 1 commissioner with option 4, and Commissioner Willie will maybe come in with option JW.
Yeah, he doesn't know what he wants. So, you know, there's an option Z.
And it looks like Commissioner Fai's both off camera but raising her hand. And I don't even see her in the list anymore. So I'm not sure what's happening.
Madam Chair, it looks like she accidentally dropped off. Let's get back on.
So whereas before I said we need this topic to come back to us, we don't. Commissioner Fai, did you have
Yeah,
something more?
I got kicked out. I don't know what happened to my internet. And I was raising to say, put me back in attendees or a panelist.
Okay, so Commissioner Fai, just so that you know what our next steps are, we have 3 of us who are comfortable with option 1. You're comfortable with option 4, and Commissioner Willie is undecided and may come up with option JW. Yes, Commissioner Treese, what more do you have to add?
I just want to ask a quick question. So when we get to the 22nd, if in fact Commissioner Willie's proposal is brought forward, we could also vote for that. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Just wanted to make sure.
Nothing's final until
Nope.
we take a
we
vote.
vote. Yep. Okay. Just clarifying that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your attention and time. This is a very complex issue and we appreciate the conversation.
Ms. Angie, I would just ask for any presentation from staff in the future. If various options are still on the table, please list them in the slides so we don't have to try and dig up old work session materials. That's all. So, great. Okay, that's it for the 8 different topics for today's work session. Are there any last needs that we need to take care of? Okay, well, seeing none, we'll adjourn today's work session. Thank you, folks.